from the International Longevity Centre. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on the new long life, a framework for flourishing in the changing world. We're delighted today to be working with IRC for HR, and we've got Jodie from IRC for HR to joining us, and Lily will be talking about a programme of work we're going to be kicking off with the Innovation Resource Centre for HR later on. Before we get started, a few sort of housekeeping rules. Internet issues might affect sound and video, so please bear with us. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat function to communicate with both the panelists and delegates, as well as a Q&A feature. Please put your questions in there. I should say we've had a huge number of questions so far. We've had about 50 in advance, so don't be embarrassed to put your question again if you've put it in there once, but we will try and get through as many as we can. If you're having issues with audio or video through the webinar, try to connect with perhaps a hotspot on your phone or an Ethernet cable. And if you get disconnected, you can come back in using the same link. Please comment on if you're watching this. We are broadcasting live on YouTube as well. If you're watching on YouTube, please do put some comments in the comments box there. Equally, if you are on Twitter, post some comments using the hashtag new long life or work for tomorrow. We're here today because clearly longer lifespans, AI, robotics are going to fundamentally reshape, change the way that we work and we live in the future. And what we've got today is actually a great group of ILC friends and colleagues who actually we've worked with for many, many years, who are going to explore sort of, how we see this world, the world of work, the changing in the context of, yes, AI, robotics, longer lifespans, but also in terms of COVID, which has accelerated some of the trends that we are seeing. We want to talk about some of the challenges for us all, what are some of the opportunities that come as a result of an aging workforce and how we maximise that. As I say, we're going to be launching this new international programme of work, and Lily's going to say a little bit more about that later. Please do start putting your questions in Q&A as soon as you can. Let me perhaps just, not going to say anything else and immediately sort of pass over to Professor Andrew Scott, who again we've worked with for a long time. And I should say, when I was last year in Andrew's office, Andrew had his ILC mug as pride of place in the centre of his office. I don't know if he'd just taken it out because he knew I was coming to visit, but actually maybe I'll give a prize of a free ILC mug to the best question or something as we get through. So Andrew, Professor of Economics at London's Business School, has just published a book on this very topic we're talking about, which is very coincidental, but also very handy. But Andrew, of course, also with Linda Grattan published the 100-Year Life Report, which has been hugely influential across the world. And I think, Andrew, there was a manga comic version, was there, of it as well?
There is, yeah, featuring me as well, which is a bit disturbing, but...
Brilliant. So Andrew, Andrew, I think is going to share his screen, and then we're going to let him sort of, talk through his perspective before we have some of our responses. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you for the invitation to talk about the new book. A big fan of the IRC and all you do. I think, you make big contributions to both the aging agenda and what I call the longevity agenda, and I try and distinguish between those two. And we're going to have a special focus on the labour market here, which I think is a really important one, not just because of all the stresses that's under with COVID, but if we are to sort of make the most of a longevity dividend of living longer, healthier lives, how we finance and support the economy is part of it. And so what we do about work, particularly 50 plus, is going to be key. And I'm going to be talking through the new long life, which looks at sort of two big trends. And forgive me while I just try and set this up. So hopefully you can see that. So really what this book is about is bringing together two big trends which are going to affect the future. Technology, and I love the word technology because of course it's a pretty broad term. When I boil the kettle, to use my ILC mug, I'm using technology, but we kind of always refer to technology as the stuff that kind of is new or doesn't quite work yet, I think is probably the best definition. But, it's the new stuff that's coming along that's going to change. And there's a whole bunch of laws, Moore's law being the most famous one, which is about computing speed, the ability to process data, the ability to transmit it, and the power of networks, all of which are growing at a very, very rapid rate. And when we talked about the 100-year life and this longer career that people are going to have, one of the questions you always got was, well, where are the jobs that are going to come from because of tech? And so we've written The New Long Life to try and understand technology and longevity and how they jointly will transform our world. And our world is still very much constructed around the Industrial Revolution in terms of how we think about careers and jobs, and also how we think about welfare support and education. And really, technology and longevity together are going to really change the rhythm of our life. And longevity already is doing that, but it's going to change how we work, where we work. It's going to change our relationships, education, and careers. And of course, what's striking about technology and longevity, we wrote the book before COVID, and basically it's a book about the long run, trying to create an optimistic story about what we need to do to seize the advantages of these trends. And then COVID happens and you think, wow, this is just, an awful disease, an awful problem. And, thinking optimistic about the long run is a very hard thing to do in 2020 when there's so many reasons to be negative. But of course, what COVID has done is accelerate both, I would say, around aging, because COVID is literally almost like a viral form of aging. And also it's sort of sped up the process of how we use technology in our relationships to work and the workplace and work-life balance. So two of the big trends that we look at in The New Long Life, they've kind of been accelerated by COVID. And that, of course, means that COVID has also been a stress test for which individuals, which companies, and which countries are well set up to deal with it. So today, for instance, I was in a webinar in Japan, and they've done pretty well on looking after old people compared to the UK, but they're struggling more with the flexible and the changes in the workplace. So, these are a stress test that is happening to us in society. I think what's really interesting about sort of technology and longevity is what I call the Frankenstein syndrome. We're worried that our own great achievements and living longer lives, and the fact that on average they're healthier lives, is a fantastic achievement. And of course, smarter machines that we've invented is also a great achievement. But we kind of worry they're going to come up and cause us problems. We can't afford to grow old because of an aging society. Machines are going to make us all unemployed and we'll become their slaves or their pets or whatever it is. And the language around technology and longevity, I think, has three key components. The first is there's a sense we can't control it. It's beyond our control. The second is it's very impersonal, the rise of the robots, the aging society. But if you think about what these things are going to do, they're going to change things very personally for us. The implications on how we live our life is going to be the really key thing. So these are not impersonal, but very personal forces. And then a phrase that I became obsessed with from the 100-year life, which is liminality, which is this sort of in-between stage where, you're no longer what you were, but you're not yet what you're going to become. And I think many of the social tensions we're seeing in society is because all the sort of social and government support networks that helped maintain a life with a traditional career and a traditional economy aren't working very well in this modern age. We're in this transition period. And we've got to kind of come up with a new system, both at an individual level and a corporate level and a government level. And that's what The New Long Life is about. What do we want that to be? And to flip those three components, I think there's sort of four things that are really important for this debate about technology and longevity. The first is it's not destiny. Auguste Comte famously is meant to have said, demography is not destiny and neither is technology. We as a society can shape the route we go down. So when it comes to technology, we can have policies that support employment rather than those that diminish employment. So these are things for us to influence. It's not too late and it's not something that we cannot influence. Then that raises the question, what do we want as humans from this? What do we want as society? Again, when the Industrial Revolution came along, at first it was exploited for economic gain. Then there was a big social backlash, and we kind of got a blend between the economic and the social to have institutions that worked for us. Things like the weekend and limited working hours and the social support system. And I think that's the third thing. We need a social narrative around that. We've got to make sure that it's society that says this is what we want from these changes and not corporates and not governments. We've got to make sure technology works for us as a society, and that involves civil society coming together and starting a debate and saying, I want this, I don't want that. And COVID, of course, is stirring up that debate, which I think is a very good part of what is otherwise a terrible disease. And then what the book stresses very strongly is that we've had this technical ingenuity to make us live longer lives, to come up with these wonderful machines. We now need social ingenuity to make it work for us. And that's kind of where we need to be innovative. You know, we've got this great technological ingenuity. Now we need social ingenuity. How does it work for us as individuals and as society? So let me just, I'm not going to go through technology too much because there's so much talked about it. I won't go through one of the key things, which is the alleged speed at which it's changing. But I like this conception by Moravec, Hans Moravec, a Carnegie Mellon professor, very influential figure in computing and technology. And he says, what we're seeing, of course, is that just as the Industrial Revolution brought about physical power, we've got machines with mental processing power. And the competence of technology is rising over time, and it's swallowing up territories that previously were just given over to human competence. So here, the blue water is where technology has risen and now does things better than humans. And then, of course, there's the rest of the terrain still currently available to humans, but which over time will get lost as the computers get more and more adept. So this is obviously going to change the job market. It's going to change what we do at work and which jobs are available. Now, if you look at the economic analysis, and there's a good friend of mine, Darren Asimoglu, who I always think is worth listening to on any topic, and he has a nice way of thinking about technology. There's three effects in which technology is going to impact the job market. One is called the displacement effect. It's sort of just automation. Machines do tasks and they eliminate jobs. And that is, of course, what everyone is always worried about. But there's another effect, which is called the productivity effect, and that has a number of different strands to it. The first is machines make workers more productive. So rather than have fewer of them, you want more of them. And also, in particular, if you think about a job is made up of many, many tasks. And if some of them are automated, if some are automated, it frees you up to do the non-automated tasks, and they can be very high value. So you think about, for instance, teaching. It's perhaps not the right time to talk about this, but AI can perhaps do grading much more accurately than humans. But then the teacher has more time available, where they can work much more closely with the student, focusing on the individual student needs. Again, think about the health system. There's lots of things that could be automated, but then the really high value stuff, the sort of interaction with the individual, is much more difficult to be automated. And that is an area where jobs can expand and grow. And of course, whether you get displacement or this productivity effect isn't just to do with the technology, it's also to do with incentives. So if you give some firms tax incentives to favor capital rather than labor, they're going to go down the displacement channel and not the productivity effect. So we've got to think a lot about this productivity effect, because this is what's happened in the past and why technology previously hasn't led to mass increases in unemployment. Then there's a third effect in the labor market, which is a creative effect, which is basically saying that, as people get more money from those who are in work, they get more productive, they buy more things and different things. And so we see a whole new job start to emerge. And that's the one that's always very hard to see because you can't kind of foretell what they will be, the new roles of the future. If you look at job titles today, it'd be very hard for people to imagine them 50 years ago. So there's these very different channels. In the past, technology hasn't created mass unemployment. It certainly created a lot of churn in the labor market, but it doesn't mean that it won't create unemployment this time. It's really about which of these three channels dominates, and in particular, the extent to which we provide incentives for firms to boost productivity. And I think, Darren always stresses that the Silicon Valley view of technology is to replace humans because humans are fallible. I think it's really important we don't go down that route. So what is the sort of summary of this sort of big picture story? Unemployment may go up, it doesn't have to. But actually, I think the biggest impact people need to think about is not whether you will or won't have a job, but the nature of what your job is and how you do it will change. And that 1486% number there is that the OECD calculate about 14% of jobs are at risk from unemployment, but the remaining 86% will not stay the same. What you do in your job, the tasks that you do, the technology you use, the skills you need will shift and change. And I think that's one of the biggest impacts that we will see. And of course, the other thing is, even if only 14% of jobs are at risk, many people will be anxious that they will lose their job. So we've got a labour market that's going to see lots of churn. We should worry about unemployment, but actually I think there's far deeper things to worry about, which is the stress and strains of churn, shifting skills, learning on the job. Plus also that, employment is one thing, but wages are another issue. And during the first stage industrial revolution, even though GDP was rising and employment wasn't collapsing, wages didn't get any benefits. And I think we're seeing something of that in the labour market right now in the US and the UK. I want to focus on older workers in particular, just because of the remit we were set. And there's lots of negatives about employment in this sector, but I want to just say a few positives about AI and robotics for older workers. I think actually this as a group could benefit enormously from it, because the people say older workers don't have technological skills, etc. Well, COVID has accelerated some of that, but also you don't need to be a genius to use Zoom. I don't have to learn how to code Zoom. I just need how to use a few buttons. And what we know about AI and robotics is they help maintain productivity of older workers. Manufacturing, which tends to have an old workforce, big users of AI and robotics, and it takes on some of the hard physical and unpleasant work. I constantly use Google for sort of reminding me about things that I've forgotten. So, I think AI and robotics could actually be very useful for older workers. Also, if you look at the labour market, what's going to become apparent is kind of as machines become more machine-like, humans should become more human-like. There's going to be loads and loads of machine skills coming through, like, for instance, calculating. Machines are just better at calculating than humans, but humans are much more better at those broader human skills like social skills, dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty, relating to people. And I think that's really important because that's going to be where a lot of the job growth is going to be. I said earlier about, doctors may not need to read a scan because the machine would do it, but they need to relate to the patient. And that's going to require much more interpersonal skills than certainly most doctors in the past have had. So we're going to see a much more growth of human skills. And that's not quite the same thing as academic qualifications. Someone who's still bears the scars from many faculty meetings, you can have lots of qualifications, but not many sort of personal skills. So, I think this is a really sort of interesting aspect of it. And of course, we will see a shift in demand towards products aimed at older customers. And there's a plausible argument that older workers better understand older customers. So I don't think the employment trends are necessarily all negative for older workers. Now, the other sort of pillar of the new long life we've done technology is demographic change and an aging society. And you're undoubtedly aware, everyone's aware that we're going through a demographic change, falls in the birth rate, people living longer. We're seeing these extraordinary increases in the number of people who are older. I think that's obviously an important story, but I think it misses something important. I prefer to flip it around and look at longevity. So here I've got a picture of the world's population, different ages, different points in time, 1950 and a forecast for 2100. These are UN data. And you can see this dramatic change in the population structure. It used to be lots of young people and not many old. We used to have a demographic pyramid, and now it's kind of becoming more like a square or something. And the standard aging society story just draws a line across at 60 and says, look, there's more old people. But I think that's the wrong way to look at this chart. I think you should look at it vertically. And if you look at it vertically, what you see is that anyone who's young today has got a lot more future. In fact, sort of at every age, people have got more future. They've got more time ahead of them. And that's a huge issue because that means everyone has to be more forward-looking and more thinking about investing in their finances, their skills, their relationship, their purpose, and their health. And that's, of course, about having more time and then restructuring the map of life, as Laura Carstensen would say, or the 100-year life argument that we invented teenagers and pensioners in the 20th century, and now we're inventing new stages of life. So we've got this longevity perspective, and that, I think, requires some pretty fundamental changes because this is a different demographic structure. I feel the demographers have too much influence in shaping the argument around an aging society by focusing on the change in the birth rate, which is a big driver. For instance, the average UK citizen, I've been looking at this recently, has never been so old, but never had so long left to live. In fact, although the average age is rising, the amount of years you've still got ahead of you has also been rising at the same rate. So the average Brit is basically still in the same midpoint of their life as they've been since 1950. It's just that life is getting longer. And that creates all sorts of issues because effectively we discover that age is malleable in the 20th century to a degree we didn't think possible. And of course, with that malleability comes all sorts of issues. It has to be worked at, but also it means there's going to be great diversity in how people age. And that's, I think, the real challenge of an aging society, that diversity story. And this is running into all sorts of sort of prejudices about what age is, and age stereotypes, which I think not just out of date, but actually don't capture the diversity, which is the real challenge. And then, of course, COVID is very interesting because it's the first pandemic we've had where the world has more people aged over 65 than under 65. And that has totally shaped our response, because 100 years ago, if COVID had happened, given the impact it has on older people, I don't think we'd have had the economic measures we've seen, because not so many lives would have been at risk. So I think what's really interesting about this is actually in 2020, we have shown across the world that we value older people. We've been prepared to crater the economy in order to save mainly older lives. I think that's really important, because that to me says two things going forward. The first is GDP. Of course, it's important. I'm a macroeconomist, but it may not be the best way of assessing how you're looking after an aging society. Health and longevity is one of them. The other thing is, if we're prepared to sort of suffer that GDP loss to save lives, then perhaps we should also be investing that money into making sure we age healthily as well. So as well as technology, there's an aging society, but I think there's also a longevity economy. It's not just there's more old people, but how we're aging is changing. And that's the really big opportunity, because the better we can age, then the better we live our lives. And of course, the less the cost that is traditionally associated with an aging society. Now, if you superimpose these two trends of technology and longevity, you've got longer working careers, but a lot of disruption and a lot of updating. So, you know, the simple way of thinking about it is the book of life has got longer, the chapters have got shorter, and some of them are going to end rather abruptly. And kind of no matter how many pages you are into the book, there's more future, there's more forward-looking things to think about, with more opportunities, but also more risks, but also much more responsibility. And partly that is our institutions and social norms are lagging behind how to support a longer life, but also simply some of the changes we've seen in society, putting more and more obligations on the individual to look after their own skills, their own finances, their own health, etc. So I'm now going to sort of maneuver a little bit, I'm conscious of time, into some of the employment issues. So I want to try and think about what this means about careers. So obviously longer careers with more transitions. I think because of that, we're going to see work and leisure distributed differently across time. In the 20th century, we created a three-stage life: education, work, retirement, with leisure coming at the end. And of course, there's still leisure at the end. But if that working career has to expand to 50 or even 60 years, then we're going to have to think about work and leisure differently over that time. It could be a 4-day working week emerges with technology. It could be that we work 2 or 3 days from home, 2 or 3 days in the office, or it could be for 5 or 10 years, I'm working very hard and then I have some downtime, I ramp up and I ramp down. Clearly, there's going to be also more times when you are doing what is called alternative work. And that is kind of the difference from the normal sort of, I have a job, the specified hours with a specified firm at a specified location. So alternative work could be consulting, it could be your gig economy, it could be contingent. And this, I think, is a really big issue. How do we provide some sense of employer responsibility to the individual in that role, which of course we're seeing lots of legal cases. But it does mean that over your career, I think you're going to see lots of cycles. Sometimes you'll be doing a job, other times you'll be basically commissioned to deliver a task. Like sort of almost like a delivery driver, my task is to just deliver this meal. And sometimes you want a job with a multitude of tasks and commitments. Sometimes they'll just be the task. Sometimes you'll be in a stable job where you sort of know that you could turn up every day and there's work to be done. Other times you'll be saying, I haven't got any work to do, I'm not getting any money. You'll be in a contingent role. And then sometimes you'll be working on site and sometimes off site, which of course is a big COVID thing. With all of this cycling, there's a much greater sense of self-responsibility on the individual to shape their career. So you're going to be much more responsible for the direction of what you do next and upgrading your skills. I don't think corporates will suddenly stop with training, but they don't do enough anyway. And how you think about your career development and what comes next is going to be much more your own responsibility. And I think we're also going to see a return to a more traditional sense of the meaning of the word work. Work in the Industrial Revolution became really turning up to factory and an office, clocking in for hours and getting paid for it. I think you're going to start to see work now as a much broader concept, where it may be you're doing some learning, maybe you're doing some networking. You may not be getting paid for some of these things, but it's not leisure, but it's investment in something to do around your work. All of this then creates a real issue for work-life balance. The three-stage life, the 9-to-5 job, if there ever existed, created one problem of work-life balance, but we're finding with COVID a whole other sort of blended problem with work-life balance. If work starts to become more than just what I'm getting paid for, when does life begin and work end? And I think that's a major challenge we're going to have to grapple with. We're also thinking about what skills you're going to use at what age. There's no one age where the human brain is best at everything. And over your life, your skill set adjusts, not just because you may be learning or forgetting, but just simply your brain is suddenly better at this part rather than that part. And then there's the motivation that how do you keep going across these different time periods? That feeds into a pretty big education agenda, because technology and education are always in a race. And if education can keep ahead of technology, then we're doing fine. But technology is about to really have a big spurt. And so it's hard to see how education can totally keep up. And also we already do quite a lot of education at the front end of life. So the obvious implication of this extra education is it's going to have to come throughout all of life. We have to do much more adult education. And already I'm talking to some schools in the US where they're looking at a 60-year curricula, because if lifelong learning is what it's about, then what does it mean to graduate? It doesn't really make sense anymore. David Blake, who's always interested in this topic, says, if I said to you, how fit are you? And you said, I ran a marathon 30 years ago. You'd say, well, that's not really answering the question. But if you ask me what my education is, I say, well, 30 years ago, I did a degree in economics at Oxford. For some reason, we take that as an answer. So education and health have to be something that we work on all the time. And given the changes in the labor market, we're going to learn, have to learn to unlearn. I think it's a lot more than just learning science and STEM. It's a lot about soft skills. This adult education is so important because we've never had to do at scale adult education. And adults learn differently. So this is going to be a major issue. And if we can do it well, then we can get pretty inclusive growth. If we don't, we have a problem. But how we learn as we go older, who we learn from and what we learn are going to be very, very different. So I don't think this is simply just offering 3-year degrees to people in their 40s and 50s. It's going to be much shorter and more employment-orientated courses. We also need to think not just about skills, but supporting and instigating transitions. In the UK, the midlife MOT, I think, is a great example of this, because we've got to make sure that everyone, not just those with money who can go and afford to do an expensive course at a business school, have the option to think about what they want to do going forward and whether they're well placed to do that. So rolling out, and I'm working with City Lit in London here, some sort of midlife transition course that is accessible and it offers people the ability to monitor and to think about their future, I think is absolutely key. This, by the way, is a huge market opportunity. There's going to be a lot of growth here. Corporates have to redesign the career process, and we'll come back to the challenges of employment later on. We've got to make sure corporates augment work rather than just automate. They just don't use machines to get rid of people, but to actually increase the productivity of workers. If you're going to have this multi-stage life, you're going to have multiple points of recruitment. And we know there's all sorts of problems about firms recruiting older workers. There's clear evidence of ageism in recruitment. More flexible working patterns where you can ramp up and ramp down your commitments. They're, I think, already beginning to make changes around retirement. The ramping up and ramping down is going to be important because we're going to have to rely upon supporting careers and carers, because the whole concept of parental leave is set to change as we get more and more older people. Parental leave won't be about your children, it'll also be looking after your parents. And then the learning platforms and ageism are important. I want to stick to time. So the government agenda is huge, and I've often wondered about what to sort of say here. But I do think, I say GDP is important, but if you look at the transitions we're about to go through, we have to try and measure the stresses of those transitions. So yeah, people may still be in a job, they may still be contributing to GDP, but if their wage hasn't increased and GDP's gone up and they're stressed about losing their job or the stress of learning new skills, that has to be picked up somewhere. And then, as we've seen with COVID, you can't have a healthy economy without a healthy population. We're not going to get back to a healthy economy until we can sort of solve the challenge of COVID. The same is true for an aging society. So just looking at GDP, I think, is going to be misplaced. Governments also have to make sure that the agenda is one that somehow has a social narrative. And here I think what's really important is some civil society. The Industrial Revolution at first was driven by firms. It wasn't a good outcome for society. And then you've got the growth of then the trade union movement, the labour movement, the cooperatives, the charitable organisations. I think we need that to emerge. We need to see civil society come together and start to try and offer something of a narrative. I hope COVID is going to be a trigger to that, because otherwise the agenda will be too much driven by what governments and corporates want to do. And then everyone is concerned about inequality right now. And I think this is the absolute key for what governments have to do. There are two key aspects for a healthier society. One is that everyone feels they're getting some benefit from economic change. And the other is everyone feels they've got some voice in the political process. And we absolutely have to work on both of those, or else we do find that civil society becomes destructive rather than constructive. This is what you need for a healthy society and a healthy economy. And the ways of doing that need to be reevaluated given the new technologies that are around. So my final few minutes, let me just try and then move into what we're seeing with COVID. As I said, it's an accelerant. It's forced us to adapt to technology and in the workplace, and that's revealing who can do that. And of course, again, that's revealing inequalities, because those with skills and resources and flexibility can, and those without can't. And it's also revealing which countries and which companies can do it well, as David noted at the beginning. It's also stress testing an aging society. The disaster in the UK around care homes shows that clearly we do not have the institutions to support good, long, healthy lives. And the bad news in the UK and US compared to what's happened in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan is a clear sign that some societies have got this better than us. I think, however, there have been some positives. I think the shift in the NHS towards precautionary health, online consultations, etc., is a really good start. And I go back again to this key learning point for me, is society has demonstrably shown that it values older people, by the UK experiencing its worst recession for more than 300 years. And that was a deliberate government policy. So I think that's a great revealed preference, that society thinks older people are important and health is more important than GDP. In the US, I hope that that revealed preference means they start tackling the case decent problems of deaths of despair, because 130,000 Americans died deaths of despair in 2018. And that's about similar to some of the losses from COVID. So both of these need to start to be tackled. The other thing I think that COVID has enabled is a more nuanced debate about age. The recognition that your chronological age itself is not a determinant of your health, and policies towards you, I think, has been a really good outcome. And I just think it's marvelous. We've been celebrating Colonel Tom Moore, 100 years of age. There's been very positive role models. But what about the labour market? Because that's what we've been asked to talk about. And one of the things that, as an economist, got me into this topic was seeing how a longevity dividend has already been paying out. So this is looking at employment data 2008 to 2018. And it's looking at how much of the increase of employment over that time period in each of these countries can be accounted for by jobs of over 55-year-olds. And it's staggering. If you look at the G7 countries, 100% of the increase in employment in the G7 for that decade can be explained by higher employment by people aged over 55. And about 2/3 of that is coming from 55-year-olds more likely to work, and about 1/3 is there's just more 55-year-olds. This is a huge number because GDP growth is basically employment growth plus productivity, and productivity growth hasn't been very good recently. So employment growth is really important. So you look at this chart and you can see that one of the main drivers of GDP growth has been employment of older workers. So, wow, that's interesting, because that's kind of almost without much direction or policy, we've seen this happen. And there's lots of challenges and lots of problems, but this is a really quite significant macro moment. And I think you can see how the labour market's changed. And these are pictures for the UK, similar ones for the US. Forgive the rather groovy colour scheme. But this is showing you the percentage of people of different ages who are involved in the labour market. Just draw attention to three things. This grey line here which is 50 to 54-year-olds, it's been rising. And so now 50 to 54-year-olds are basically the same as people aged 25 and upwards. They're involved in the labour market just the same way as everybody else. Then there's this line here. This is 55 to 59-year-olds. They are now more likely to be in the labour market than 20 to 24-year-olds. And finally, we got here, this is 60 to 64-year-olds. They are now more likely to be in the labour market than 15 to 19-year-olds. This is a really big shift in the labour market. This older worker segment is now a big part of the labour market and an important part. You can see, by the way, the rising rates of these other older categories as well. So this is important macroeconomically. What's happening here is really important. And this is where we get a big setback. Now, the labour market is obviously under a huge amount of stress right now in the UK and elsewhere. And there are various policies that mean we don't quite know what the full shakeout is going to be. But this is 2020 Q2, the biggest fall in employment has come from those aged over 65. Now, we don't yet know if that's voluntary, involuntary, but this I think is a really major challenge, because if you think about the stress that COVID's causing, we've got higher government debt, we've got lower economic growth. We need to get growth. And one of the ways of getting growth is going to be making the most of that longevity dividend. And you're seeing, of course, is the two main stresses in the labour market are those at the beginning and those at the end. And they're the two who probably suffer the most permanent effects from employment, because this group, if they're leaving work before they intended to, they have a shortage of retirement savings. And this group, we know, if they start in a difficult labour market, it has a lifetime effect on them. So thinking about policies to support this group as well as this older group, to me, seem absolutely a key part. And I think what we've seen with the labour market is as the labour market has more and more older people, we sort of haven't really extended our policies to think about that group. And I would say don't treat them specially, but just acknowledge they're part of the labour market. And just as you'd have measures to have anyone supporting anyone in the labour market, you need to support those as well. Now, what we also know is lots of ageism about hiring older people. And obviously, over time, that may or may not disappear. But in the face of that ageism, individuals have to do a lot more around self-employment, gig economy, and entrepreneurship. And the question is, how do we provide the skills and support for that? Because it's not really out there strongly at the moment. So there's a role for NGOs, there's a role for policy, and I also hope there's a role for educational institutions to do that. Corporates, I just go back to the agenda I had earlier, the sort of multiple entry points are going to be key. When it comes to governments, what is their agenda? Focusing on a technology that augments and doesn't automate, that helps create value in jobs rather than just destroy jobs. That's about thinking about taxes and subsidies. Of course, governments will have to think about supporting upskilling and reskilling. The only thing about that is that's very much about having people develop the skills for the new jobs that are needed. I also think governments need to focus on providing new jobs for the existing skills that people have. Not everyone is going to be able to upskill to become a full stack developer. So I think actually part of that is not about having these big, new industrial giants, but also quite small scale local entrepreneurship, which I think will be very important for tackling some of the inequality issues that we have. And I think that's a focus on local services and local communities, which again, COVID, I think may well start to sort of as a location start to change, start to encourage. So a government policy that focuses upon ensuring technology is used to augment, not automate, clearly a major skills provision at an adult level, small scale entrepreneurship to be encouraged, possibly artisans, and then a focus on local community as a way of fostering jobs for some of those older workers. I'll conclude there because my time, I've done 32 minutes. The irony of talking about longer lives is I always run out of time. But this is just a summary slide. So thank you. I tried to cover quite a lot in that time and I hope it was interesting.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew. Really, really interesting. I think the 60-year curriculum is a fascinating idea, and I suspect we'll come back onto lifelong learning. We had a speaker at our conference last year, as well as Andrew, of course, but we had a speaker from the United Arab Emirates who are currently working on a 50-year plan, which is fascinating from a government point of view, because of course in the UK it's very difficult to get the government to develop a plan beyond 6 months, and when we're talking about longevity, it's extraordinarily challenging to make the changes we need. So I think thinking to the long term in terms of longevity is really important. And of course, I think 3 things I suppose I took away. One was that, yes, technology is going to change the way we work, and particularly in the context of longevity, and we need to maximize the opportunities and minimize the risk. Secondly, I think, and really striking, all of us are going to need to do our jobs differently. Our jobs are going to change. And then I think thirdly, this value of human skills, where potentially older workers are in a strong place. I remember it might even have been a BT futurologist at one of our events a number of years ago, who talked about sort of the care economy, and the care economy offering huge potential for growth. And yes, you can automate monitoring of people. What you can't automate is empathy. And actually, certain skills around empathy, those human skills, are the ones that we're going to need to work out how we support both younger and older people to be able to basically deliver. I'm going to pass on now, before we get to our panel, to Lily, who's going to talk us through our programme of work we are about to kick off. Lily is currently, talking about sort of clearly technology. Lily is currently in Cologne, so clearly doing this sort of thing across a number of countries, even a few years ago, would probably have seemed inconceivable. We've got the west coast of America through to Germany, connecting in. So it's amazing how we can do that. But secondly, I think. I think the point that Andrew made around our jobs changing, that Lily's responsible for our sort of global and UK communications, public affairs work. And it's striking to me sort of how, on the one hand, we can do things so much quicker and do things so differently. So we were in Abu Dhabi at an event late last year, and I remember us between the hotel and in the last half an hour as we were leaving the hotel, we managed to get a press release and press comment out. And by the time we'd got to the airport, it had already been featured in a couple of national newspapers. And when you think in the old days when I used to start, we posted press releases. The world has changed. And yeah, actually, on the other hand, coming back to sort of Andrew's point around automate around the jobs changing. Actually, there were lots of areas like that where we haven't modernized. We still think public affairs and lobbying is sending a few petitions and doing some joint letters. And I wonder if actually where we're really struggling is actually, the technology has changed, but we haven't yet worked out how to make the most of that technology to deliver sort of the sort of societal change we need. So anyway, that's enough for me. Lily, tell us about what the program we're about to kick off on.
Thank you, and we'll have another conversation about my job apparently. So thanks David, and thanks Andrew for a really, really interesting presentation. I think it's done a great job of sort of setting out quite where we are and how we're not just going to be sort of potentially working longer, but actually, as David mentioned as well, the jobs that we're doing are changing, and so are our working lives. And that's really one of the reasons that we wanted to start this project called Work for Tomorrow, together with the Innovation Resource Centre for Human Resources. We're also working with some of our partners at Newcastle University. And through this programme of work, really, which will be about a year, we're looking both to sort of identify the big sort of key changes, the big challenges that are facing an ageing workforce. So be that older workers or younger workers, sort of, the workforce as a whole. And then from the new year, starting a global competition where we'll actually be looking for innovations that are responding to these challenges and these changes to respond to an ageing workforce. So I won't spend all too long on this because I think, Andrew, you've done a much better and sort of more in-depth job at showing us through this. But clearly our workforce is changing. We're seeing a growing share of the workforce that is older. Obviously, we're seeing trends around automation and technology that are going to change the way we work and which jobs are sort of taken over by humans as opposed to robots. And obviously the current situation around COVID-19 is clearly going to affect us, at least in the sort of shorter term, over the next few years. But not only sort of our workforce itself has changed, but so are our working lives. And this is an image that one of our friends in ILC Brazil, has done, and I'm using it here. I went, again, sort of go all the way into it, but, you know, clearly the sort of segmentation of life of sort of, you know, around sort of 20 years in education, another sort of 40, 45 in work, and then 20 to 25 in retirement is sort of fundamentally changing, where we're seeing different sort of lots of transitions throughout our lives, slightly more complex lives, but hopefully a bit more interesting, and different portions of caring, either for children, for parents, for grandparents, for grandchildren, sort of learning and reskilling throughout the life. And so actually, if we're planning the workplace and the workforce of the future, we need to make sure that there is flexibility enough to sort of weave in and out of work into caring, into learning, and making sure that this is all part of our journey. So someone joining the workforce today is expected to have around 5 different careers in their lifetime. So not just jobs, but actual careers. So we need to make sure that that the way we design work is sort of responsive to that and allows us to transition in and out of these, as Andrew said, sort of slightly shorter and more abrupt chapters in our lives. And we've done quite a lot of work as well on the longevity dividend. So these are some of the figures we published at the end of last year. Clearly, we're seeing people contributing at all ages. So from workers being around sort of 30% of the workforce, we'll be seeing that sort of massively increase. And similarly, it's not just the number of people working at older ages, but also people's wages. So actually by 2040, around 40% of all wages, at least in the UK, will be earned by workers aged 50 and over. We're currently doing a global version of this report as well, but the figures are looking quite similar. But essentially lots of this growth is driven by older workers, but also that, you know, the future of work just looks a little bit more mixed. And it could yield a significant longevity dividend, but I think we're clearly not doing enough at the moment to support people to work longer, to have these sort of changing working lives. So some work we did a couple of years ago called The Missing Million found that in the UK, about 1 million people between 50 and 64 are forced out of the workforce early because of either health or care needs or caring for a loved one. Andrew also touched on ageism, and, you know, this can sort of happen either at the recruitment phase or sort of within people's working lives when you think about sort of professional development opportunities. And clearly making a workplace that that is more flexible, that supports people to take, you know, to take time off to care, or to care alongside their jobs, that allows people to have training throughout their lives. Essentially, an inclusive workplace works for everyone. So we're not just talking about older workers, but we're talking about workers of all ages. And if we design well for the future of work, then hopefully it'll work for everyone. So what are we doing? As I've mentioned, we're launching our Work for Tomorrow program today. So throughout this, we want to be identifying innovations that respond to an aging workforce. So be that about promoting health and well-being in the workplace, creating opportunities for professional development regardless of age, ensuring diversity of staff and thought, or offering flexibility in the workplace. And as I mentioned, this is a sort of 2-stage process where the first bit is really about getting to grips with, you know, with these challenges, hearing from people across the world, both from a sort of policy perspective, from an employer perspective, from what people are experiencing themselves, before we then go out and hear lots of exciting things that are happening. So this is our website here. Do feel free to take a look. And as I mentioned, we want to hear from people. So if you have you know, your key challenges that you feel are facing an aging workforce, either from your own experience working or as an employer, from your research, if you have a bright idea, an existing product or service that you think might be quite interesting, get in touch, or if you'd like to write a blog or video. I've put my email and my Twitter here, and they're also both on our website. So we're really excited to be doing this. Also, thanks to IRC for HR, and yeah, get in touch. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Lily. It's great. And I'm sure we will be letting you know more about that. And we've got a series of discussion webinars later in the year as well on the different themes. Let me now pass on to Caroline, who ILC have worked with for a long time, back to Caroline's days when she was Director of People and Policy at BT, been involved and working on issues around equalities, is currently on the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Vice President of Carers UK, Trustee of RSPCA. Again, very good friend to ILC, and hope we can do much more with Caroline in the future. I think that, clearly technology has a massive potential to help address some of the challenges around equality. But equally, I do remember there was a story a few years ago about someone who'd and I think it might even have been an Amazon algorithm that they created to shortlist, and it started off fine, and it basically gradually started to discriminate against women and people who weren't white, because of course algorithms are written by people. Caroline, let me pass over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been asked to speak briefly, you'll be relieved to hear, about what I see as the three biggest challenges we need to tackle if we are actually going to create a society and a future way of working that recognises and optimises the role of older people and older workers. Now, I mean, everything you've heard so far tells you how vital older people are to the health of the UK economy, but also actually to the global economy. They contribute as workers, as purchasers and users of services and consumers of products. Part of the reason for the growth is that more of those older people who are working are also continuing to spend. And yet what we saw during the pandemic was a return actually to seeing this large and very diverse group as a single body, to which blanket assumptions and policies were upheld with, I think, quite disastrous outcomes. So what was the outcome? We saw an association between age and vulnerability that actually said a great deal about our approach to older people in this country, but it led to decisions that effectively removed two of the things that Andrew talked about as being essential. One of them was choice and the other was the voice of older people at a critical time. So at best, and I think this is what we've seen again in some of the figures that Andrew has shown us, so at best it froze those older people out of the workforce, and at worst it denied them basic rights. We saw mass do not resuscitate notices. We saw the NHS coming out with statements like we must restrict NHS space to the young and fit, while we also denied services to older people. GPs refused to visit or to assess those who weren't presenting with typical symptoms. And what's happened is that's led to a disproportionate and I think ongoing impact on older people, on their short and long-term health outcomes, and on the perception of this group by our society. But what happens next is more important. We've got to move away from ageist assumptions and move to an age-agnostic delivery of medical services that actually recognises that biological age is not an indicator of capability or future contribution, and it is as individual as the people in that group. We've got to prioritise medical services that, as a minimum, prevent age-related deconditioning, things like blindness, lack of mobility, dementia, but as an essential, include older people, take their opinions into account, and take the fact that they are in our society in large numbers into account. Secondly, we've got to pay greater attention to the link between population health and economic health. We know that longer, healthier lives can also be happier and more productive lives. Unfortunately, that requires two things that most governments seem to find quite difficult. Firstly, it requires a fundamental relearning of the many principles embedded in the policy assumptions behind provision of public services. And I mean the big things: housing, transport, education, work, benefits, and health. Secondly, it requires joined up thinking across all of those departments areas. So you have to relearn, and you have to do that in sync across the piece. So let me give you an example of that. So we still cling to the belief that at its simplest, education is a foundational function that revolves around the need and therefore the ability to acquire a knowledge base that supports us for the rest of our lives. We need to revise that view, and we need to do it quickly. What education needs to be seen as is it's about the ability to read the horizon, be adaptable, acquire and apply skill. And that means including knowing how to determine what is relevant and valuable amongst the millions of pieces of data that fly at us almost every day. How do you pluck out of the air the ones that really make a difference? But also it's about what do we need to do in our teens, in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s to be emotionally, economically and academically healthy in our 70s, 80s and 90s and beyond, because we have to blow away all of the assumptions. We could still be working and contributing and running and doing all sorts of amazing things in our hundreds. So why don't we plan for that when we're very young? That has to be affordable. It has to be available to everybody throughout life in easily adaptable forms. So my third challenge then is about ceasing to see life in a very linear way with its assumptions about childhood, which is framed by this foundational education, adulthood, which is framed generally by employment and parenting and increasingly caring, and retirement, which generally is framed by very little, actually. We tend to see pictures of poverty, you know, we can heat or eat, or we see happy oldies gamboling on a sun-drenched beach. We don't ever really see them, you know, working or producing, or, you know, it's a very odd part of life that's just simply unframed by anything. We need to fill that gap. So we need to understand really that longer, healthier life that is also enjoyable and productive, that has purpose, means that we're going to kind of zigzag through periods of learning, work, leisure, duty, fun throughout our whole lives. We don't have these blocks anymore. What we're going to do is find that each has a purpose. We take a break because we're tired. We take some learning because we need to change our skills. We work because we need to fund ourselves, because we want to do something fabulous. All of these things are interconnected, and we will weave through them. And we need to find innovative ways to fund that. It's not just going to happen. And David knows that I bore for Britain about this particular subject, amongst others, to be fair. But I'd really like to ban the concept of retirement and pensions, really. You know, it's that whole period just becomes the great unknown, you know, when we have no real insight about how long we'll live, few levers to lift us out of ill health, poverty or loneliness. We need some kind of fund for life that we can draw down when we need to pay for a learning, a health or a revitalisation intervention. These things need to fund our lives and not be about a game of acquisition and then waiting to see how long we can eke it out at the end of life. And while I'm kind of on my soapbox, I think one of the other things we need to overcome, because it's a real barrier to us taking radical steps in the use of public money, is this cynical view we have of people that is so deeply embedded in our societal thinking. I mean, for example, all of the evidence states that if you give money to those living in poverty, they'll use it to lift themselves out of poverty. And yet this cynicism is so deeply embedded in our societal sort of psyche that, you know, generally people are lazy, they're ruthless, they're scam driven, that instead of choosing to put our resources where they really have an impact, we spend money developing mass and costly schemes to ensure that public money is put to good use through programs that we can control but don't actually change very much. So we need to embrace, I think, a very radical vision that actually, you know, most people are pretty decent. They want to do the right thing. And let's build our policies on that basis and watch and see how our society flourishes. I believe it will. So as you've probably figured out, I'm a bit of a kind of closet optimist, I suppose you'd call it. And I am certain that we are finally going to see the need for a universal basic income, probably just before we see the real impact of AI. You know, that joyous moment that we shouldn't be afraid of, benevolent worklessness, when AI releases us from the burden of those kind of repeat functions. And it enables us to use our collective intelligence to do what really matters, learning how to get on with each other and how to nurture our planet and the billions of wonderful non-humans we share it with. One of the questions I was given is, who does it well? Well, nobody yet. Lots of countries have a few areas of great innovation, great policies. Some corporates are leading change in what it is to work, and lots of people are doing great thinking. I'd like to think maybe this conversation is the point where we finally start joining those dots. We use our collective positivity, intelligence and insights to create a really tangible framework for flourishing in our changing world. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Really, really interesting. And I think we've been pushing, ILC been pushing for a long time for, you know, a new model of a welfare state as a result of an aging society. And clearly, we certainly need to explore whether our current sort of model really, really works in the context of longevity and aging, and whether it incentivizes the right things. Your point, a minor thing, your point about all of that data and stuff and information that comes at you, and I appreciate ILC sends plenty of reports out to people to add to this weight. But I remember we had someone at one of our sessions, another of our events, talking about the fact that, you know, in every 20 minutes there is more than 20 minutes worth of information relevant to your role produced, which means at the end of every day we're actually less well informed and less expert than we were at the beginning of each day. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, or whether we can use the technology to actually help ensure we're picking up on the right sorts of bit of information we need. Thanks, Caroline. Let me pass to Jodie now. Jodie, only recently got to know Jodie over the last few months, and we've been really, really excited about getting to know her. I'm really excited about the program of work we're going to be doing with ILC for HR. Jodie, let me pass over to you.
Thank you, David. It's a privilege to be here. So let me just quickly mention I'm the executive director of Innovation Resource Center for Human Resources, also known as IRC for HR. Since 1926, our mission has been to advance the knowledge and practice of human relations in organizations. And we currently pursue that mission with a goal of helping organizations, leaders, and the workforce to thrive in the digital economy. I had a feeling by this point in our session, the big issues would have been extremely well framed by Andrew and Caroline, which they were. So I thought I would use my comments to share some insights that come both from our recent research as well as some personal experiences. And I hope they'll be useful to our discussion. So the road ahead isn't a problem to solve, it's an invitation to create. The woman who said this, Jen Gresham, is a scientist and a retired US Air Force leader. And Jen led a 2-day future of work think tank that we funded, which she called Work for Humanity. It brought together a diverse, multidisciplinary group of thinkers, including a rocket scientist, a philosopher, a strength coach, a human-computer interaction scientist, a US Marine corporate general, an attorney, the research director at Google. It was a fascinating collection of perspectives, and it was a privilege for me to participate. So when I joined this group, I had already participated in multiple activities that focused on predicting what the future of work would look like and on identifying what the implications would be for business and HR and the workforce. But it was the first time that I participated in one that started with the question, what do we want it to look like? And this simple shift in mindset from the future being a problem we need to define and address to it being an invitation to create really changed the dialogue. And it was a great reminder of how important it is to start with the right question. So inclusive design creates outputs that are both available and desirable. Inclusion by Design was a series of workshops and conferences we co-sponsored. And those looked at the challenges of older women navigating the future of work in a digital world. We often think about inclusive design, or at least I did, as something we pursue for the benefits of a particular audience. For example, people with challenges in mobility or hearing or seeing or touching. But when it's done well, inclusive design is actually a source of innovation and creativity that winds up benefiting most, if not all, users. So for example, this will probably be a really familiar one, the cutouts in curbs that allow wheelchairs to get on and off the sidewalk also serve people on bicycles or folks pulling luggage or pushing baby strollers or prams in the UK, right? Or moving heavy equipment. Another example you might be familiar with are the larger handled kitchen implements. These were designed for someone actually whose wife had arthritis and wound up being preferred by just about everyone and turned into a huge business. We also often think about these challenges as permanent and the target users as static. But many challenges like this are actually temporary or situational. So a 30-something parent working at home with a dog barking or children around might be just as likely to need a device that reduces ambient noise as someone who has a hearing loss, or might need a device that lights up or vibrates rather than makes a sound that can't be heard easily. Digital interfaces are notorious for using poor color contrast, which makes them difficult to see in different light conditions, or they use colors that are not well seen by people with color blindness. And these kinds of things impact people of all ages and disabilities. So when it comes to inclusive design, availability and accessibility are critical, but desirability matters too. And one of my favorite examples here is, the personal emergency response button. In preparing for this presentation, I went through, was just looking at some of the ads online, and they're so dated now of, I've fallen, but I can't get up. And I don't know if you see those in the UK, I'm assuming they're similar to the ones we see in the US. But why would an older person want the stigma of wearing one of those around their neck when we now have cool internet connected watches that include this capability and everyone wears them? And we have digital home assistants that are listening and connected to the outside world, which also don't have a stigma associated with them, and everyone uses them as well. So my point here, and I think a great sort of outcome from this particular project, was that when we design with inclusion in mind and we do it well, everyone benefits. And I think this is also another reason to make sure we include a broad spectrum of human diversity when we innovate. So this next line, we have 5th generation technology and 2nd generation social systems. This came from someone in a program we funded that brought together a cross-industry group of organization development and business leaders. And the goal of the project was to design the digital organization. The companies included some of the most I can't mention them, but they included some of the most well-known and successful global leaders in technology and innovation. You would know all their names well. And yet they were all struggling with the social system challenges of leading and operating in a new world. And a world characterized by horizontal, collaborative, cross-functional, and extended enterprises and ecosystems. So they had technology for a new world, but social systems for an old one. I've spent most of my career in management consulting, leading large-scale business transformation programs. I have implemented all kinds of technology, and I'm not a technical person, but I understand and appreciate and benefit from its incredible value. And technology has for sure, transformed how we work and how we live. It creates incredible possibilities when it comes particularly, and I'll echo this for you, Dr. Scott, to augmenting human experience and human capabilities, augmenting, not replacing. Whether it be through AI or robotics or connected devices or voice recognition or exoskeletons or virtual reality, all powerful forms of technology. But that said, we tend to over-focus on investing in technology when the greatest challenges are the gaps in organization design, culture, and behavior, our social systems. We also don't invest in making sure that everyone can use and has access to some of the most fundamental components of technology. I know this is an issue in the UK. It's certainly a huge one in the US. And this includes things like reliable Wi-Fi, which some people say is like electricity. And so many people don't have access to it. It's become essential to our ability to work, to learn, to monitor health, to access medical services. And of course, it's been further intensified by the pandemic, where so many people are at home trying to do those things. One other recent project I'll mention has focused on social networks and the ways in which they drive things like collaboration and innovation and productivity and well-being. There is a great body of knowledge emerging on how to do these things well. And there's a related demand for skills and roles that I think may actually benefit from more experienced older members of the workforce, people who have strong relationship skills, personal networks, and social capital. Lastly, I'm going to comment on COVID-19. I mentioned here, I use the bullet, it's an innovation trigger and an accelerator. And I think, Andrew, you've talked a lot about it as an accelerator. So it's hard, again, 700 pound elephant or whatever large thing in the room. It feels wrong to talk about the virus without acknowledging the devastating losses that it has brought and continues to bring to millions of people and businesses. We are truly suffering here. I'm in California and things are not great. But at the same time, it has shined a bright light on many of the inequities and lack of inclusion in our workplaces, and certainly in the US and society more broadly. And I think if there is a silver lining, perhaps it's an opportunity for us to rethink many assumptions and practices that we've taken for granted as either necessary or not possible. I think, Andrew, you called it a stress test. I think of it as also a natural experiment, but maybe stress test is a better label. But things that we said we can't do, or that won't work, or will take time, et cetera, somehow happened and happened quickly in the past few months. I have heard so many, I've heard so many company executives and HR leaders talk about implementing multi-year digital transformation plans in a matter of weeks. David mentioned earlier, going online. It's incredible what we've accomplished in the last few months, that we necessity, the mother of invention. But more than that, I think, some of the things that Caroline has talked about that we know we need to do and we don't do, why is that? Somehow there's this collective will that has emerged, which is quite powerful and I think, worthy of study. I've also seen more empathy emerging from the shared experience of COVID-19. And I think with empathy has come an increasing awareness and acknowledgement of human needs. Many employers are taking the time to understand the impact of their employees' personal lives on work life. And I think the result is that individual differences, which in the past may have been things people did not want to make known, are being destigmatized. In the past, people might have been ashamed to ask for individual differences, getting some assistance, sort of with things outside the normal work experience. They may have been really ashamed to ask for those. But now many of them are being asked by their manager what they need. This feels really significant to me. I know it's not universal, but I believe COVID-19 is an opportunity to change our notions about what is possible when it comes to achieving a more inclusive, human-centered work experience. And often changing a story about what is possible is the hardest part of innovation and change. And I think it's an incredibly powerful opportunity to change the narrative. So I started my comments by saying that the road ahead isn't a problem to solve, but an invitation to create. Similarly, I'd like to suggest that aging is not a problem to be solved, but an opportunity to innovate to create a better quality of life for everyone. So on behalf of IRC for HR, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And I'm really excited to be supporting ILC in pursuing this important goal.
Great, thank you, Jodie. And I'm going to immediately jump onto Stefan because I'm conscious it'd be great we can get as many questions as we can in. And I don't, Stefan Real, one of the UK's biggest experts on management, wrote for the FT on it for a number of years. And also journalists. So of course, I don't know if journalism is, you would say journalism is struggling or thriving as a result of technology. And actually, of course, the Press Association for probably 7 or 8 years now have been writing stories in certain sectors just using computers to write them. So perhaps worrying times for your own profession. But let me pass over to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Dave. The trick, of course, is if you're coding for journalism, is to write some lines of code to ensure that people can still be misquoted technologically. Thank you. It's a very interesting conversation. Let me just say a couple of things, not to take up too much time. Yes, indeed, my trade is menaced by technological change, and it's a wake up for us as for so many others. I think what I'm concerned about most is, in the figurative sense of the phrase, babies and bathwater. Because as Jodie rightly says, people have moved very quickly in the past few weeks and months. And it's been quite exciting and eye-opening. And, some things change and have to change. Some things actually would be quite nice if they could stay the same. And I'm sure we're not going back to an old normal. A different version of normal will eventually appear, I hope. And the difficulty in managing our way through this, managing change, of course, are the trade-offs between what's new and exciting, but what was valuable about the old ways of doing things. I suppose I'm thinking partly about this, much of the talk about the so-called death of the office and the idea that there'll be much more working from home and so on. And of course, it's been a revelation, no doubt, to a lot of skeptical bosses that people can actually get things done at home. They don't have to be commanded to commute for hours a day at great cost and damage to their health to show up. And it's great to be on a panel with Caroline. I mean, we've both been talking about flexibility. We've all been talking about flexibility for decades, and it's been a very mixed picture, of course, with some good examples and some much less good ones. But finally, some very senior people have been forced to work from home for an extended period and have, I think, been probably largely pleasantly surprised, even amazed at how doable that is. This does not mean that we do not need workplaces and offices anymore, even if we're not necessarily going to ask people to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles a week, 5 days a week. If I think about the past 30 years of work that I've been doing, not always, but so often, if I have learned anything, it's because someone older and more experienced and wiser than me has shared something with me that they knew, sometimes gently, sometimes perhaps less gently, but anyway, they've shared it. And I think, in spite of the loyal audience I can see who've stuck with us for an hour and a quarter already, that these sorts of virtual meetings, whichever brand you use, have been a vital replacement and been absolutely vital to keep work going, but they are not completely adequate. They do not completely recreate the physical proximity or what we used to call real life. The real world of people actually being in a room at the same time and sharing things and firing off each other and grabbing, with that serendipity, grabbing moments of conversations with people you wouldn't have even have met. I could make a parallel, actually, since you mentioned journalism, with the physical newspaper that some of us still quite like to get our fingers on every day, although fewer and fewer, unfortunately. Of course, online, you search for things, you go to things straight away, perhaps you find them. What you don't find, what you aren't presented with, are other people's points of view, what other editors' views, stories that you would never have picked up, which you do perhaps only at the weekend these days for many people, when you have a newspaper to flick through. So I think there's a sort of human parallel to that in terms of teams and working. The digital is great, the technology is fantastic and exciting, but it's an augmentation, as Andrew said. It's complementary to the analog world that some of us have enjoyed. So I think that's what I'm nervous about, that we are going to make it harder for people to learn at work. We're going to make it harder for teams to function well if we rush too fast and too far into an only online, only virtual world. And that'll have negative consequences for all generations. Because it is that mix, I think that others have touched on, it's that mix, that diversity in the workplace, diversity in organizations, where the creativity and the productivity really comes. It's why there is a downside risk of displacement through new technology, with the vital creative human spark being kept out in some way or jettisoned. So I think, yes, the positive side is how adaptable people and organizations have proven to be in recent weeks and months. We've probably surprised ourselves, many of us. It's been so much better for many people than we feared it might be. And yet working from home, of course, is not easy for a lot of people, especially younger people with less space, especially for parents of younger children or people with lots of caring responsibilities. It's built in some flexibility, but it's not a simple solution to the world we're in now. And equally, if a year from now a vaccine is widely available, and if something more familiar can be returned to in terms of working patterns, then let's try and learn all the good bits and not reinstate unthinkingly bad things that aren't necessary, like long and harmful commutes. But equally, let's not be too dazzled by what the machines can do, because as we have seen in the UK in this week, apparently brilliant bits of code, an algorithm can lead to some unwanted outcomes, and human beings have to intervene to find a better outcome and to take responsibility, because machines cannot take responsibility ultimately for these things. That's what human beings have to do, and that's why it's difficult, and that's why humans are important. So thanks, David.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Really interesting. I think your point at the end there about space and offices and different generations having different sort of space. Coincidentally, a colleague's just asked me a question on Twitter about sort of someone who living in a small place wants to actually go to one of their neighbours somewhere where basically a house in their street or somewhere where there's just Wi-Fi and somewhere to sit. Now, it strikes me as we're about to do this program about innovation. Wouldn't it be a fantastic product if you could go in the same way we can rent car parking spaces, we can go into someone else's house and sit and work with a couple of other people and do, have that communal engagement. So I think there's really exciting ideas that we could be doing that perhaps Lily and Jodie and others will really want to push. George, extremely important. You have an extraordinarily important role, not to put pressure on you, but clearly the fact that the UK government has put aging as part of its industrial strategy, right at the heart of it, the Healthy Aging Grand Challenge, really highlights that the UK government does seem to see this, the older consumer, the older worker, as really playing a role in driving economic growth in the UK and globally. So big job, George. Tell us how your job fits into what we're talking about today.
Well, I suppose firstly, just to reflect on some of the stuff that Caroline and Jodie were saying, so change is hard and long, and it's very difficult to get people to focus on it when they're threatened by immediate sort of threats around unemployment, around actually graduates not finding a job at all. So, and I think when I think about that, what Andrew and Glenda Grattan have set out in their two works, it is a powerful case for how our longer lives are a cause for optimism, and we should be building on that. But also, the iceberg piece, there's huge societal change needed to actually make that come about, and that's not going to be easy. But as you say, probably starting with the Foresight report in 2016 on the future of an aging population, defining the Aging Society Grand Challenge, and if you just flick to the next slide, or is that me? But just up here as a reminder, and I suppose I just reflect in the box that the mission for the Grand Challenge. So it's a mission, not a target. Why? Because it's a really, really complex undertaking. So it's a worthwhile ambition, but we didn't actually know exactly what did it. We had a lot of good ingoing hypotheses, which we're working and developing. I think the time frame 2035 is really interesting, and it echoes something that I said, I think, at your annual conference last December. Beg your pardon. It's one bit that I couldn't actually manage to sort out. It was really important to get the longevity agenda away from the biotech firms and thinking much more about the societal change and how to bring that level of innovation about. And I think that dialogue, I've seen that happening more and more, which is positive. And I always say, the difficult bit is the bit after the comma or the second comma, which is actually narrowing the gap between the richest and the poorest. Because without that focus on the modern UK term levelling up, you actually aren't going to achieve that target. But what we really need out of this is some of what people have echoed before, which is a more equal society with their opportunities for everyone. So I said there are many factors that influence it, and the way that government's thinking it is put things into 4 broad themes, which are illustrated below the box. And I think it's important to reflect that although one of those says work, learning and purpose, actually employment runs through almost all of them. Work as a source of financial well-being in later life, as the source of the revenue and taxes that are going to help us build homes and families and communities. And of course, health and care will be an increasing part of a future workforce in one way, shape or another. So I think actually all this really marked a big inflection point in government thinking from aging populations as the problem, as Andrew sort of said, to and longevity, or how long we live as the measure, to actually thinking about how well we actually live our lives. And when we start thinking about what Andrew says about how age is malleable, that to be 70 today is not the same as it was in 1950, we can start to see what he also says about how government, business and education need to change. And that just not only makes sense, it's a real imperative, actually, if we're going to make something of this. So for me, it's clear that work and rethinking work throughout the life course and into later life is a really important part of all that. And when I think back to when I first read The 100-Year Life, I was left with a nagging doubt that a multi-stage life was not something that was easy to apply for someone who'd been a builder, a bricklayer all his life, a tailor with failing eyesight, or someone actually who contributed through unpaid care for very long periods of their career. And actually what I really welcome about the new long life is it starts to create a narrative and address those questions, as well as highlighting the additional global employment challenges posed by technology and the so-called fourth industrial revolution that we've talked about. So I suppose at the turn of the year would have been saying there's a pressing need to address the prospect of declining workforce by retaining the knowledge experience of older people. And of course, then COVID came along, and much has changed in our perceptions with rising unemployment and really bleak prospects for those leaving full-time education and looking to join the workforce. So what have we been doing for it? In the short term, actually, one of the things that has been amazing is to see what sort of innovations have come out as a result of COVID and some of the stuff that we funded. So it's not all science and technology. A huge amount of the work that UK Research and Innovation is funding, it relates to arts, humanities, social and behavioural sciences, things to actually really understand how this new world affects us and what opportunities there are to do something about that. And in just a small sort of way, the whole issue around the impact of COVID on Black, Asian and minority ethnic populations has really shone to highlight that there's actually more than just a sort of genetic or a medical component. There are probably very strong cultural and economic factors at play as well. And I think the same is true. So innovation, I think we see is a key part of rebuilding the economy. It's perhaps not quite soared into plowshares as you might have expected, but what happens to an economy built on the internal combustion engine and global travel? And the recently published UK Research and Development Roadmap reaffirms a commitment to addressing these big societal challenges and says, and I quote from it, "We will need to be even more creative and innovative to adapt to the new normal and to recover swiftly from COVID-19. It is our duty to build a future which is greener, safer, and healthier than before. And I think the fact that actually they've included healthier than before is actually really significant in the way that government investment is going, because there's been an awful lot of talk about a real opportunity for a green revolution. I think there's also recognition there's an opportunity for a health revolution coming out of this as well. I do think that recession could have profound implications for intergenerational fairness. And whatever the shape of the recovery, we mustn't lose sight of the value of age diversity as a facet of a diverse, productive and creative workforce. Recession, I think, will also bring into sharp focus the differences in the experience of the richest and the poorest that we've talked about earlier. So I think, to conclude, aging well is still very much on the public agenda. Being creative and innovative in the way that we approach work for tomorrow, supporting people to remain healthy and able to continue contributing into later life in its many different forms of contribution will be an important part of that. And actually, from our perspective, recognizing the great role of not just science, but arts, humanities, social and behavioral sciences. And in that respect, I'm delighted, one of the things that David hasn't mentioned about, that one of the government investments that was announced in recent months was a Design Age Institute, a coalition led by the Royal College of Art's Helen Hamlin Institute, but including ILC, including the National Innovation Centre for Ageing in Newcastle, Oxford University and others. And I think we have a way of thinking about rebuilding. In parallel, the work that I specifically lead has sort of dodged COVID so far, and we were at a very lucky stage of continuing to with our programs. So our major Trailblazer programs are mobilizing, and we're just negotiating, making an announcement about where they've got soon. Really delighted that our investor partners are actually committed to continuing to invest, and we're already seeing that come through. And we've had a minor sort of adjustment to our program for commissioning research, simply to give people, particularly universities, more time to pull together proposals. But we're on track to sort of launch the major research packages that support that as well. So mobilizing is going full speed, and trying to understand how we co-produce with older populations who may still be in lockdown and reluctant to do that, I think is an important part of what we are currently thinking about in terms of driving this agenda forward. So thank you, David.
Thanks, George. I think your point, just to pick up one thing, the intergenerational fairness point, particularly interesting over the last month or so, where you've started to see, both in the UK, papers like The Times and across the world, the lump of labour has returned to public policy debate. You've seen all sorts of people saying, basically, older people should step aside for younger people in the light of COVID. And it's sort of begun to gain a bit of traction again, which I think is probably something we need to sort of head off a bit. There were lots and lots of questions, and we've also got the ones that were submitted in advance. Please do keep adding to them, and you'll see there is a little thumb sign as well, so you can upvote your favourite sort of question. I'm going to perhaps kick off, because there's quite a few questions around learning and technology. Are the changes, Stephen McNair, I think, is on the line. We've been talking about some of this for 40 years. Actually, are we really going to see a change in the way we work? Are we really going to see these 5 careers? Is it all really that different? There's also a couple of points out there around learning and inequalities, and actually the extent to which we can ensure across the life course learning is accessible to all. So let me open with sort of fairly broad sort of lifelong learning, and who of our panel wants to come in first?
I'll happily make a start on that. I think it's a great, I think Stephen's I can't comment about the 5 careers, and I'm always slightly nervous of those stats that there's 8 generations in the workforce and we're all going to have 5 careers. I think history is a bit more of a soup and a bit more of a blend than that. I think in answer to Stephen's question about lifelong learning, the first is it's so low at the moment, I suspect it will rise. That's kind of the cheap answer to the comment. we can reiterate the logic, which seems to be stronger. There's technology and there's longevity together. I would say that actually you're already seeing quite a big increase. It's just not happening in the normal channels. So we're seeing a real raft of apps online, privately, for-profit courses being offered. Now, of course, the challenge with that is that they're then taken up by the people who already have high levels of education and high levels of income. So the question is, how do we get adult education at a core, widespread level to be done? I think at the moment there may be a gap, which is that we still think of education mainly around degrees. And we've seen the growth of universities, and literally, colleges become universities. That is the key way of providing education. If I'm going to learn over my lifetime, it's not so obvious I'm going to spend quite so much money up front getting that education, because I need to spend some money throughout the rest of my time. And I do wonder if we're going to start to see universities start to focus on this new market and recognizing that they're going to start to offer shorter, more simpler courses that are stackable and portable, that build up to something. The thing is, I think the type of courses we're after aren't necessarily the ones that universities are very good at. And that's not necessarily criticism of universities. I don't think that necessarily the role of universities is to prepare people for the jobs firms want them to do. I think that's kind of firms' responsibility to a large degree. But I do think if you look at the Industrial Revolution, you saw a big growth of sort of community type colleges. There was a new technology. You saw a labour movement also trying to make sure that the workers got the skills that give them better jobs and better conditions. And I think that may be where we need to start to look at. That, of course, is the adult education colleges who are just hitting harder and harder and harder. So I don't know if we need new providers or we need new ways of bolstering existing institutions. I think universities coming together with adult education colleges would be a great idea. They used to do that and they've stopped doing that. And then I just think a whole bunch of online stuff. And online has got its strengths, has got its weaknesses, but it does provide a new way of trying to learn. And then the question is, what will corporates do in this area? There's some interesting signs that corporates are beginning to recognize that if they've got this, what they call this layered workforce, some people working full-time, some sort of on the bench, some gig economy, when they want to use them, they need to make sure they've got the right skills. And they're starting to think about how they can provide, perhaps with other firms in the area, a skill set so that when they want them, that contingent workforce has got the skills. I wonder if that may be something we'll start to see develop more. But Stephen's point, something's not right at the moment because there's a crying need for it and it's not happening. So that's where we do need that social ingenuity.
But I also think that there's a need for some radicalisation of this agenda. So what about if we decided that rather than just paying me a salary, particularly in a gig economy, what I did was pay you 80% in salary and 20% that I put into a portal that you could reach into and draw out healthcare, you could draw out learning, you could maybe draw out some kind of health option around maybe taking some time out to regenerate in between tasks and things. Lots of corporates are starting to experiment with bringing together some of their processes to create those kind of options. So, even in what I was doing 15 years ago, we were creating breaks for professional services people by using our volunteering programs to let them go off and do something completely different at a gentler pace, come back refreshed. We had an academy that wasn't just about, that old HR myth about we want to make you the best finance person or the best project director or that, but actually about learning that makes you the best person you can be, because the better the person, the better the employee and the better, so there is that thinking. It's just, again, this problem about it's not creating critical mass and we're not joining the dots up. We're not letting people know it's there or why it's important.
I mean, just to back up what Caroline says, Singapore has a scheme where the government give money out to people and they have to do adult courses, and they're kind of not prescriptive. You can kind of do whatever you want. And we've introduced maternity and paternity leave. You could, I say, over your working life, you've got 3 months of money to use to fund some sort of course. I actually worry less about the funding and more about actually having the right courses and getting the support for people to do them. Every university is going to encourage the government to provide funding for people to do courses. I think the really key thing is how do you then help people to make sure it's the right course for them and it's the right transition or support that they need at that point in time. I think, just as you have in finance mis-selling, you have a great risk of mis-selling in education as well.
Thanks, Andrew. I think certainly the way we learn is changing, and I think the way my son learns is very different to the way I do. Lily and I are both big fans of Duolingo, and actually my son, in terms of language learning, my son, I have to say, there is very little you can't learn now from YouTube, including, I should say, my I have a how to make arancini video that I made myself that a year and a half on has got 8 views. So if any of you really want to learn how to make arancini, but seriously, you can learn anything on some of these things. Stefan, do you think sort of in the world of sort of managers that companies are going to really take the opportunity of some of this technology to support learning? I have to say some of the stuff I've seen from companies has been a bit more about you should do this course and we'll be able to tell whether you've done it and we'll score you and give you the results for it, rather than it being more about a process than about actually supporting learning. You think that's fair or not? Or where do sort of employers and managers come in here?
I think you've got a point. I fear that, for example, when you look at things like ethics, so-called ethics training, there's that email about, have you done the ethics course? We can tell you haven't done it yet. We want to see this ethical employee emerge 2 hours later. Yes, there is a risk of that. And of course, in the short to medium term, so many businesses are simply in survival mode. So it's perhaps unfair to be too harsh about some decisions and choices that might be being made right now. What we hope, though, that people can soon start to raise their sights about the medium and longer term, what will be truly sustainable and what will be required in the future. And there will be absolutely, as Andrew and Caroline was saying, rounded learning people, which is what we've always wanted at work, isn't it, actually? And I think Caroline was saying earlier that sometimes we just recognize what we've already half known all along or half been doing all along, but is absolutely necessary in crisis. You take these decisions quicker. But yes, of course, learning. And as I was hinting, the joy of the age diverse and the diverse workforce is that the learning can go on all around you spontaneously, even some of the time, and caught, not taught. So you don't have to do the course. You just pick stuff up by being physically together and working together. So I'm not completely pessimistic, but I think I note your concern. I think you've got a point to be worried that we will miss the opportunity to learn how to learn, as it were.
I do think, though, this have you done it yet comes from the fact that everything is mandated nowadays, because we've taken trust out of the system and replaced it with regulation. So now, we used to be happy to see that people had learned because we could see them doing it. We could feel things were different. Now we say, have you done that horrible online course? And did you do the little test at the end? And, for most senior person, we might as well just ask the PA. That's who does it, actually. But, so we've got this sort of mentality where, because we have this concept I was talking about earlier, that generally, people aren't going to go out and do the right thing, we put in all these mechanisms that start to devalue things that we should see as really valuable.
No, absolutely. And of course, within those sort of, if you're not, if there is limited purpose for the learning or it's not seen as valuable, then actually, you can see why. Well, we know across all sorts of sectors, people cheat the system. Again, my son, there's this thing called Hegarty Maths, where basically the kids have to watch this video before they do the maths answer. My son goes away and watches some music and then comes back and fills the form. We know people will just cheat if they're not interested, and it's not really supporting learning. George, is sort of, the healthy aging grand challenge, the government's interest in industrial strategy, to what extent is sort of learning and lifelong learning a part of that?
It's a growing part, but it's been a small part so far. So the skills agenda was something that came to the fore actually last year before this as a missing piece. So if you want to create a new industry around quantum computing, clearly you've also got to think about skills as well as technology, and that applies to almost everything that we do. I was going to say, so one of the things that happened during COVID is Innovate UK ran a competition, fast response competition. They got more applications in 2 weeks than they normally get an entire year, for a share of originally 20 million, and we decided actually we got so many applications, it had to be 40 million, and even so the standard for getting through was quite high. Within that, a huge amount actually was on skills. How do you cope with a new environment where you've got infection control and lockdown and all sorts of new sorts of things going on? There was innovation in that space. There was innovation coming through in terms of how do you kickstart local economies, and is there some of the work that's been done around sort of online marketplaces applicable to actually suddenly saying, as we found, we have a crisis in picking fruit and asparagus in the Vale of Evesham. How do we actually draw in different sorts of people, tell them in the modern health and safety sort of way what they've got to be able to do, and get them employed quite quickly? And I think we would see some of that building through. I've also seen, and we're hoping that some of this will come through to scale, people looking at the care economy specifically, starting with things like how do you try and get people to understand that what the caring is like in a virtual world, such that actually those that actually it will never suit actually are put off at an early stage before they enter a course and do lots of things, while others are drawn in and upskilled, maybe from informal to formal and paid, etc., on the way. So we're beginning to see some of those sorts of innovations come through, and I think it's not UK research and innovation's prime role to look at skills, but we certainly see that actually it's an adjunct to what we want to do in terms of developing future industries.
Thanks, George. Jodie or Lily, do you want to come in? Jodie, the lifelong learning, is it seen as a huge thing in the US?
Absolutely. And I guess I wanted to get comment on something that Caroline said about the importance of joining the dots. And there's a lot of creative initiatives going on in the US. For sure, lifelong learning is getting a lot of attention. There's a lot of corporates that are involved in IBM has a platform that's trying to address multiple things, which is it's creating industry-wide recognized what they call badges, which are shorter, more concise. Learn something for a particular skill, earn a badge that shows at what level you've achieved that skill, and something that you can then of course apply directly to your your employment search. But I think there's this sort of convergence of, well, I think COVID again is disrupting the education industry, certainly the university system, which has already been under a lot of pressure in the last 5 to 10 years to really rethink what it is that it does and the value of what it delivers. So I think we may see some change come out of all of this again, maybe over the next few years. And I think the need for shining a light on some of the innovation and creative solutions that are taking place. There's a lot of initiatives of community colleges partnering with local companies to come up with very specific programs and curricula that meet, that to prepare people to actually do the work that companies have jobs and need to hire people for. So this idea of more just in time and very relevant kinds of learning for the purpose of jobs or career opportunities is another important piece of this. And I think there's some really great things going on, but there's not a lot of scale, and I don't think they're not clearly being communicated, I think. So it's a lot of work to go find some of this stuff if you're a person looking for these solutions. And I think even the infrastructure around how we help direct people toward those solutions and and change people's mindset about this notion of a lifelong learning process. Those are all dimensions of this kind of system that I think we need to really put together more thoughtfully. Very fragmented, I guess, is maybe what part of what I was saying.
Thanks, Jodie. I'm going to move on, and we've only got about 10 minutes more. I'm going to just, there's quite a lot of questions in there around ageism and age discrimination and technology, and perhaps I'm just going to throw all of those together, and then perhaps after that, I was going to ask our panel for, you know, maybe 30 seconds or so, and do skim through the questions. If there are any of those questions you particularly want to respond to, or any final observations, you can do that after. But let me sort of spend a few minutes, as there's so many questions on age discrimination. You know, the point I made earlier around sort of, you know, the algorithms potentially, you know, not necessarily tackling the challenges of discrimination generally, but to what extent do we think the tech can help us here? Who wants to sort of come in?
Well, I'll start with, you know, I've seen or rather heard from a sort of a residential facility with older, not a care facility, but what we call extra care, where suddenly actually they've been doing work for a long time on voice recognition, but as a project, suddenly they found that voice activated controls and access to technology completely transformed their ability to continue to interact with their residents. So I think, you know, the barriers to using technology will continue to sort of drop. You know, I remember working with a major chip manufacturer sort of 15 years ago, and they were just developing a device for older people. Its relevance was wiped out overnight with the introduction of touchscreen on the iPad. I think voice is going to be something similar, and the more that we can interact intelligently with technology and it actually works, the more accessible that will be for older people. And I think that's a definite line of development for us.
Great, thanks, George. I have to say my incompetence at even understanding TikTok, let alone being able to create a TikTok video, implies there may well be new technologies that go way over all of our heads. Other Caroline, from a EHRC or your HR perspective, there, where can we get to with sort of ageism, and is there a role for sort of tech in this space?
Well, I think there is, and part of the problem is the two stereotypes I was talking about before. We have kind of, if you look at the continuum, most of our, the imagery and most of the issues that we see raised are either about older people in difficulty and not coping with life, or these extraordinary older people, the fastest ever marathon for a 100-year-old. We don't ever really see imagery of all of the brilliant older people, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, who every day use technology. I mean, just look at those people who have used technology to keep in touch with family through this. And that's partly because it's become so much simpler. So what I would say about technology is, and I would say this coming from technology business and working with the lovable geeks in the labs, is that they forget that us, the rest of us, are mere mortals. So, for example, during this period, I use Zoom, Teams, Google Hangout, WebEx, everything else. Would you please put the buttons in the same place? It takes me the first 5 minutes of every video thing to work out, oh, okay, which one is this? Where's the button to unmute? Where's it? So we have to think about usability is my point. And I think Jodie made the point about, if you design for inclusion at the beginning, not only is that the right thing to do, it just makes good economic practice, because changing and adapting things as they are developed is really costly. It's a waste of time, takes you longer to get it to market, all of those things. So there is something about technology could be the differentiator here. It's definitely an enabler, but we have to think more about usability, and we have to close that the gap of imagery and comment, you know, between these two stark things at the different ends of the continuum, and get back to, let's have the images of older people who are not extraordinary, but they are just using this stuff to make their lives better. You know, and that is absolutely true in the workplace as well. You know, some of the earliest adapters were very, very diverse. Lots of, you know, at BT, long service company, 50 years not unheard of, 50 years service. People adapted, they changed. And I think that's part of the lifelong learning process. We almost don't see it. It's the reinvention of ourselves to do the job that is now presented in front of us. So I think there is a lot that we have to do here. A lot of it is about really understanding what happens, and a lot of it is about designing technology for easy use by everybody.
Can I just join in and just a little bit build on the ageism? I mean, clearly there is ageism, and it's significant and it's substantial and it's limiting and it denies people all sorts of opportunities and rights. I think as a society, we are very confused about age. And that's partly because there's a lot more people living longer and we're seeing a greater diversity. And on average, people are healthier, and the averages are very misleading here. So we've got a really sort of messed up language around age, full of out-of-date stereotypes and trying to stereotype. I think, however, we also recognize that something must be changing. You know, I showed you those employment stats, and I think sort of implicitly, people are sort of, there's been some adjustment. Perhaps it's people don't recognize who's old and who's not so much, and so that's helped an adjustment. But I think that there's sort of two areas that really worry me. The first is, within this community, we're all trying absolutely to help everyone live the best life they can. But we do then start to talk about positive age stereotypes. We start saying, oh, people are wiser, or they're smarter, or they're better with people. And there is some empirical evidence, but actually, if you're going to avoid ageism, I think you've got to sort of deny yourself the positive ageist stereotypes as well as the negative ones. And I think the reason for that is that the thing that really worries me is these generational debates, because I think they are so misleading and so confusing. You know, the whole baby boomer, millennial, Gen X, just always sets things up as zero sum. And this is why I think, you know, longevity rather than aging is a better way of seeing it, because, you know, 100 years ago when the Spanish flu happened, a 20-year-old in the UK and the US had about a 50% chance of making it to 70. So the young did not become old. So you can really see a sort of battle between young and old. But nowadays, the probability of making 70 age 20 is about 90%. So we're sort of, this generational argument, I think, is really misleading. I think that's where we get when we look at ageism. We start saying, well, this group's got this attitude, this group's got that attitude. I think ultimately we're saying people are people and they're humans, and they can't be reduced to whether it be a generation or an age group. And I think our language about young and old just too frequently slips into generations. And that is where I think you get this zero-sum conflict. So I worry greatly about the whole debate around this topic. It's clearly a huge and important issue that needs resolving. Some progress has been made, a lot more needs to be done, but it does slip too uncomfortably into the generational debate, which I think is counterproductive.
Thanks, Andrew. I don't know, on the imagery side, we've got a major issue in aging with stock images, which is not particularly helpful. But I don't know if any of you ever looked at the women smiling at salads Google images, because they are fantastic. But actually, similarly, if you look at older people in technology, there's quite a lot of older men typically looking very puzzled with a smiley younger woman looking over their shoulder showing them what to do. It's really, really interesting, that sort of the stock imagery sector has got a lot to answer for, I think. Let's move on to some final comments. Who should I come to? George. So let's have sort of a minute or so each with reflections, comments, or answer any of the questions. Say whatever you want, George.
Andrew's last point, I was sort of making a point about intergenerational fairness. I actually am not sure we've made the case with businesses for age diversity as an important facet of a diverse workforce. And I think there's much more we can do with research to evidence the value that sort of diversity brings.
Great, thanks, George. Caroline. Oh, you've gone mute. Yeah.
So I think one of my concerns is what I mentioned right at the beginning. We saw ageism created by a blanket approach to a group of the population that said older people equals vulnerability. That had dangerous consequences. And I do think that we need to try and help politicians, those who make decisions. Some of the decisions in the NHS were based on that very dangerously. We need to help people make decisions on the relevant factors only.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Stefan.
Well, I think the exciting but difficult management challenge is obviously to listen to the voices of all the generations, all the ages, all the people you've got in the workplace, and to respect everyone's perspective and to try and manage those trade-offs if there are trade-offs to be made. I think it's not easy, but it's much more interesting than a less diverse workforce. A more diverse workforce, I think, is by definition much more interesting and probably much more creative, even if the task of making it work is harder. But that's the challenge we've got to take on.
Thanks, Stefan. Andrew, your messages other than buy your book? People should.
We've heard about the book, but yeah. Yeah, so I think, what fascinates me and worries me about aging and longevity is it's about every aspect of life. It's about all ages. So it's a very, very, very big agenda. And we're having, I think, to do a response a bit like the Industrial Revolution, where our economic and social frameworks and our support networks need to totally shift and change. So that means I think it's going to take a long while. We're a little bit behind and the change is going to happen quickly, but we have to have a social narrative. I keep coming back to this role of civil society and trying to articulate and pressure and push for ideas to influence policy, because it's so broad, this agenda, it kind of slips between the cracks of so many different policy departments. We've got a government departments that are really based around quite a segregated model of there's education, there's pensions, there's employment, and actually all these things somehow need to come together. So in the UK at some point was going to have a longevity council. I think that's kind of important to try and think a little bit about how you measure over the whole map of life. And then just going back to the ageism comment earlier, what I think we do have to worry about is any group, no matter what age, that is marginalized, does not get its voice heard. And I think that's probably what we need to start to think more about the ageism debate, because there are certain groups like the care homes whose voice wasn't heard and they were appallingly treated. I think that's really where the role of civil society has to stretch out. There was a huge role for NGOs and charities in getting the right social response to the Industrial Revolution. I think the same will have to happen this time around.
Thanks, Andrew. And Jodie?
Yeah, I guess a few quick thoughts. One is about the importance of changing the narrative with stories and images, as Caroline mentioned, but also with data. So I saw an interview about a week ago on CNBC in the morning about a venture capitalist who was starting a new VC firm. He's 83, I think. And the new VC firm is focused on providing funding for older entrepreneurs, as well as entrepreneurs that are developing products and services for the older consumer. And the interviewer said, well, wouldn't people much rather fund younger entrepreneurs if given the choice? And the venture capitalist, who's 83, said, no, actually the data shows that entrepreneurs that are 50 and over, those businesses tend to be the most successful. That's a piece of data that changes somebody's idea about what that really means. And I think just, we're in the midst of a really careful look at marginalization and isms, at least in this country. And ageism is just one of them. And when I think about one example is the use of technology to increase empathy. I've seen some really interesting uses of virtual reality to have people have very powerful experiences of what it is to be that other marginalized, whatever group that is. And I think the more we can drive more empathy across our society, the better. And I guess yeah, I'll leave it there. I know we're already over.
Thanks, Jodie, and thanks for your support again. Really excited about the programme. Of course, Lily,
Likewise.
that's on to you.
Sure, and I'll keep it really short. I think, you know, as has been mentioned today already, that COVID-19 is really this sort of slight accelerator, but also a magnifying glass, and sort of showing quite a few of the problems that have been going on for a while, and that hopefully, actually, as Julie mentioned in a different example there, it's shown us a bit of empathy by sort of everyone experiencing quite a similar thing, and really showing that, well, if one part of society is struggling, actually it affects all of us. So hopefully that's a good learning experience.
Great, thanks. And thank you all to our panelists, and thank you again to Jodie. We keep an eye out for our work for tomorrow programme, and do get in touch with Lily for more information, and we will be keeping you informed via our mailing list. Caroline mentioned earlier the 15-hour working week and sort of technology and Keynes, and well, ILC actually did some analysis 3 or 4 years ago, where actually I think what we found was that if you now divided the number of years by the number of hours you work, actually we're not far off the 15 hours, but the problem is that we're squeezing it all into between our 20s and our 50s, or 20s and 60s, and actually if you divided that across the increasing number of years we live, actually we're not far off the 15 years. For those of you who aren't aware, we are moving our Future of Aging conference to virtual, but please take a look at that. We've got some really interesting sessions very relevant to this. We're linking in with George's agenda. We are doing some work with the Department for International Trade, and we have a webinar planned in a couple of weeks around sort of the export market in relation to the longevity dividend. So clearly, you know, keen to sort of engage you all in that, in terms of actually how do we see the opportunities of age in terms of the economic opportunities. And then finally in the autumn as well, we will be publishing, as Lily touched on earlier, our new longevity dividend paper, which looks across the whole G20 and European Union into what the real sort of economic, social value of age is. So and we plan to try and find a way of taking that to finance ministers across the G20. I'm going to stop there. Thank you all so much for joining us, except to say I'm only 998 subscribers away from being able to monetize my arancini video. So, you know, and I can see the money starting to roll in already. So, you know, I will just leave that there, you know. Thank you all for joining us, and for your support. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.